Hello everyone, welcome to my Last of Us Remake, grounded difficulty, no damage, no upgrades, no safes, no shift doors walkthrough. This is the beginning of the game, Boston, and if anyone has watched my original walkthrough of The Last of Us, you'll understand that I've neglected two other restrictions for the time being. I mean, one of them I'm definitely not including, but the other one I'm a little bit iffy on. So I haven't decided yet if I'm going to be doing no crafting alongside the other restrictions because the Firefly section at the end of the game, it definitely doesn't play very well in The Last of Us Remake, and on my first playthrough, I couldn't for the life of me figure out a consistent way to get past the final Fireflies before you get to Ellie, and I had to resort to using one smoke bomb and a brick, and I managed to scrape by the skin of my teeth. It was absolutely luck-based. That's all it was. And I really don't like the way the sequence plays out. And that's why I'm thinking I might craft some smoke bombs just so I can deal with the fireflies and get past them. That's why I'm iffy on the no crafting restriction. And then the other restriction, the no training manuals restriction, I mean, they're very easy to come by. I don't see how anyone could possibly miss them. And on my original walkthrough of The Last of Us, when I neglected certain training manuals, certain parts of the game felt more awkward and certain sections felt more broken than usual because I didn't have access to very specific training manuals. And that is why I am not doing no training manuals with this game, because this game is even more awkward than The Last of Us 1 and The Last of Us Part 2. And in all honesty, guys, I would honestly say that this is my least favorite of the Last of Us series. Like, Last of Us Remastered would always be the best game of the series. Last of Us Part 2, I like that game, but the balancing in that game and certain changes that they made with grounded difficulty, and the fact that grounded difficulty doesn't have a lot of the same traits as grounded difficulty from The Last of Us Remastered, and then some of the poor balancing associated with The Last of Us Part 2, that's why that game is brought down in quality. But I would honestly say that The Last of Us Remake is of a lower quality than The Last of Us Part 2. Like, I have come across so many mechanical problems with this game, and if you want to see a bit of those, check out my questionable designs of The Last of Us Remake Part 1 video. It's almost 30 minutes long. I mean, some of them are, like, reused issues. I do showcase the same issue multiple times, but there are still plenty of diverse issues present with this game. And it's honestly unexpected. I mean, I expected them to actually hold true to actually respecting the original Last of Us, but they said they remade this game from the ground up, but I would honestly feel like this game is of a worse quality than The Last of Us Remastered. In some cases, it isn't. I mean, there are some mechanics that this game does that are better than The Last of Us Remastered and The Last of Us Part 2. But they don't make up a significant difference to really influence my overall ranking of this game in relation to the other Last of Us games. And I just feel like the problems outweigh the positives largely with this game. But you're not going to notice it initially. I do feel like the initial beginning to the game with Boston and also with Billstown, the sequences work pretty well. And then we get to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is really where the game shows diminished quality, and it really becomes quite a slog. I must have spent hours on certain sequences just trying to figure them out, because the sequences, just trying to do them normally, they didn't flow correctly at all. And they were just such a slog. They dragged on for a very long time. There were just a lot of moments where I was using exploits and gaming the system to my advantage in order to balance out the sequences, because, like I said, this game inherits some of the poor balancing that The Last of Us Part 2 had with certain sequences. But I'll talk more about that when I get to Pittsburgh. But let me just start from the beginning with this walkthrough. So, I'm obviously playing the game on grounded difficulty, and compared to The Last of Us Part 2, grounded difficulty on this game feels like the grounded difficulty I was expecting. Because in Last of Us Part 2, grounded difficulty didn't inherit this one modifier that was present with The Last of Us Remastered, and it's that your weapons do increased damage, but at the same time, the enemies do increased damage to you. Grounded difficulty in The Last of Us Part 2 was just very lazy. It was just survivor difficulty, and a lot of the strategies that you just used on survivor difficulty would have just applied to grounded difficulty. The only times where this wasn't the case was during the stealth sequences, because on grounded difficulty, and this also applies to the remake, the enemies can see you super fast on this game, and from what I've noticed with this game, they have almost infinite range. Like, I was in Ellie's section, where you're in those cabins, and you're doing that stealth sequence, and there's a guy who was across the world, and he could see me from within the first cabin you enter. I cannot believe that this game has some of the most nuclear ranges I have ever seen for a stealth game. I mean, it's just so unlike a stealth game to have nuclear range like that on vision cones for the enemies. And it's something you're going to have to get used to with this game, and I believe The Last of Us Part 2 had something similar. Yeah, it did, because I remember I was getting seen from a large distance during that train yard encounter playing as Abby. So, yeah, if you're used to the balancing of The Last of Us Part 2, you'll probably come to this game and just be at a better baseline. That's what I'll say. But, a lot of the game's mechanics have changed. They've tried to update the HUD to be more like The Last of Us Part 2. There are a lot of accessibility options in this game, which is a really good design choice. In fact, for this grounded difficulty walkthrough, I'm going to be enabling the awareness indicators. Only the awareness indicators aren't tied to the accessibility options, they're tied to the HUD, but they're needed for this game. In fact, for this game in particular, compared to The Last of Us Part 2, I'm going to enable the option for the awareness indicators where they're always on display, because I feel like the enemies on this game are more bullshit compared to The Last of Us Part 2, and there are just a lot of moments in this game where you don't know if it's a mandatory combat encounter or you don't know when you've triggered the last known position, and with the awareness indicators on at all times, the moment they disappear, you know you've triggered the last known position. And not only that, but there are just times where the enemies don't do the correct behaviors for actually showcasing that you've gone back into a last known position. And like I said before, there are certain sequences where it's almost like they want you to be in combat. Like that big sequence when you're at Tommy's Dam and then you ride those horses and then the horse gets hit by a Molotov and you have to fight those enemies. That sequence in particular, it really feels like a mandatory combat encounter. It's unclear when the game chooses to give you a last known position. It's just one of the most bizarre choices with that section, but I'll talk more about that. We're coming up on the first combat encounter, and this combat encounter is very simple. And unlike the enemies in The Last of Us Remastered, when these enemies come out of cover, they actually go through a dedicated animation. In The Last of Us Remastered, the enemies instantly came out of cover, and they could shoot you very quickly, but here, they have to actually go through an animation of actually prepping their weapon, and this gives you a time to shoot them. However, I have had moments where when I've tried to shoot the guy when he's coming out of cover, my bullet somehow misses. I think when you first start the sequence, it's almost like the enemies have a bit of invulnerability, and when you get tests to actually attack the enemies, that's when the invulnerability seems to wear off, and you can actually kill these guys. This guy's actually dead, but when you finish off the last enemy in these sequences, they go into a surrendering state, and they do that more frequently in this game from what I've noticed. But yeah, he's dead, and now we have this sequence. So the stealth on this game has been drastically changed. It's just like The Last of Us Part 2. So in The Last of Us Remastered, you could remain standing and jog behind humans, and they would never hear you. On this game, they've made it where you have to remain crouched at all times. If you are even jogging for a bit, they will hear you, and they will spin around and know exactly where you are. And I understand why they did this, but I don't feel like it's suitable for certain sequences in the game. Like, there are certain stealth sequences in this game where speed is definitely an essential, and it helps balance out certain sequences. But with this new capability that the enemies have on this difficulty, it's definitely going to drag out some of the encounters a bit. And also, the enemies on this game have the same peripheral bullshit where the enemies in The Last of Us Part 2, the peripheral vision was god tier. And there are just a lot of moments in this game. Oh, this right here, this is very important. Did you notice how I mantled? There is a huge bug with this game. So, in every single stealth game you've ever played, you've been able to move the left analog stick when you were mantling, and the enemies have never been able to hear you while you're mantling. I mean, there are certain cases where, like, when you're mantling in stealth games, sometimes you stand up at the end of the mantle animation and you have to crouch. That I understand, and it's a problem that should have been addressed with those games, but they don't do it. Here, there is a huge problem where if you are moving the left analog stick to continue moving when you're mantling, the enemies can hear you because for some reason, the game at a certain point in the mantle animation assumes that Joel is standing. And if you're moving the left analog stick, because the enemies can hear you while you're jogging, that applies here. It applies to the mantle animation because the game is confused as to whether Joel is in the mantle animation or not, or whether he's actually crouched or standing. And I showcased this in my questionable designs of The Last of Us Remake Part 1 video, and it's so bullshit. So when you mantle through that window, you have to make sure that you are not moving the left analog stick at all during that mantle animation. And as soon as Joel drops to the ground, that's when you can move. Although I have had moments where even when he's finished the mantle animation, the moment I've moved, the enemies have somehow heard me. This happened in one Pittsburgh encounter that I've showcased in my questionable designs of The Last of Us Remake Part 1 video. It's so broken. And I don't understand how Q&A could possibly miss this kind of issue when they were most likely playing with awareness indicators on. They were most likely testing grounded difficulty to make sure it worked. And you're telling me nobody ever noticed this issue with mantling? This is the only stealth game I have ever played where moving the left analog stick while mantling somehow generates noise. And if you haphazardly mantle through a window, but you're still holding the left analog stick, which is what you're used to with every single stealth game you played, you're gonna get spotted. How fucking stupid is that? That right there is a poor design. It needs to be fixed. But no one's going to spot this because no one's playing on grounded difficulty right now. But here are a couple of enemies. These guys, when they're walking around, they don't have the ability to do the turning animation. So it seems like Naughty Dog assigned certain AI the ability to do turning animations, just like in The Last of Us Part 2. Only I felt like with The Last of Us Part 2, every single enemy had the ability to do turning animations whenever they were in an unaware status. But when they go into an investigative status where they know you're in the area, but they don't exactly know where you are, they don't do any bullshit turning animations where they just turn around and just spot you out of the blue. And like, I've had moments where the enemies have done turning animations 2 times in a row on a single walk cycle, and it's so bad. Almost as bad as this. So, even though this game is meant to be like The Last of Us Part 2, you can't move Joel when you're strangling enemies. In The Last of Us Part 2, when you stabbed an enemy, or whenever you were strangling enemies as Abby in The Last of Us Part 2, you had the ability to partially move, and this allowed you to stay out of an enemy's visibility. I mean, with Ellie, she had the ability to move a bit more compared to Abby, but it was still cool nonetheless that you could move while you were strangling these enemies and actually remain hidden behind cover, because one of the main problems with Joel's animation when he does the strangle animation is that he takes such a huge step backwards that it's easy for enemies to spot him. But at least on this game, they give him the ability to immediately finish off an enemy if he happens to be spotted during the animation. But they put this in, yet they didn't give Joel the ability to move while he's strangling an enemy. Just have it be similar to Abby's strangle animation. Why is that so difficult? Like, there are certain sequences on this game where if you happen to step out of cover when you're strangling an enemy as Joel, it's so easy to be spotted. And it doesn't complement the design the enemies have where they just spot you so quickly on grounded difficulty. And this sequence right here, this is where the turning animations are going to become a problem. So regardless of whether you do this sequence the very first time or you restart the encounter, the strategy is always the same. I had to restart the encounter because I moved at the wrong moment when I was inside of a crate, and an enemy happened to spot me. But right here, you need to go around this side, and don't go for this guy immediately. Check in front of you to make sure there aren't any enemies moving, because when you restart the encounter, sometimes there's a guy right there, and he's doing a turning animation. So wait until there are no enemies in front of you, then take out this guy and drag him over here. And then right here, you need to check your right. This guy right here, you have to make sure he goes back around the corner, and then you're able to move. The first time you start this encounter, he's generally going to be around the corner, but here you have to wait a bit. It's not going to be so much of an issue, and I'm waiting right here because I'm worried he might be doing turning animations, but I don't think this guy is able to do turning animations. It's the guys in the middle of the arena that are able to do turning animations. This guy right in front of me, he is capable of doing turning animations. And right here, you've got to hug the right-hand side so that the guy behind you doesn't see you. And then this guy right here, you have to wait until he sits up against the cover. The first time you start this encounter, he's not going to be there. You have to wait a bit. But if you restart the encounter, he's going to be here. And this guy, you see him doing the turning animation right now to his left? That's what I mean when I say you've got to worry about the turning animations on this game. I really don't like the turning animations in The Last of Us Part 2. Not only were they just an obnoxious way to just drag out the stealth encounters, but they could also screw with the enemies' pathing. I had moments where the enemies would walk around in a circle when they were in the middle of their turning animations. It was so buggy in The Last of Us Part 2. But that right there, blind fire your bottle and make sure the reticle is on that part of the building so that you'll be able to lure those guys away and their backs are turned away from you. Then you'll be able to strangle this guy. Apparently this guy somehow heard the bottle. I did not know the enemies had that kind of range on their hearing. Or maybe he's responding to another enemy who's actually hearing the noise. I don't know. But I was at least able to choke him out. And you have to choke that guy out because the game will not let you through the door. It will deny you. Yet I recall in The Last of Us Remastered, you could charge through that door even when there were guys near you. And Tess would just lock the door behind her, and then you'd be able to deal with Robert. But they've changed that. They're forcing you to get rid of that guy, which it's a minor thing, but I don't like it either way because it's too easy to be spotted during that sequence because of the stupid turning animations. Like, I got spotted one time, and I was stunning that guy with a bottle. I tried to get through the door, but it would not let me through, so I had to finish the guy off, and I could have easily been shot by a gun. It's bullshit. And that right there, you got to make sure you're not holding the left analog stick when you're mantling, because again, the guy will hear you. And I've included this in my questionable designs of The Last of Us Remake Part 1 video. But this sequence is very simple, yet they've given this its own encounter. Not too sure why they would give this its own encounter, but I imagine a lot of people complained about certain encounters not being in the encounter select in The Last of Us Part 2. And so I guess to cover their regions, they're making sure to include every single encounter as part of the encounter select. I mean, if they did that with The Last of Us Part 2, that'd be great, because there were certain encounters in The Last of Us Part 2 that were neglected from the encounter select when they were pretty difficult encounters. Like, I remember the very first combat encounter you got with the Seraphites in Abby Seattle Day 2, and that was not included in the encounter select. So, it's a good thing they're covering their regions, but still strange nonetheless that they would include this as part of the encounter select when this is a very simple encounter. And this right here, the reason why I was able to grab this guy is not only was he very close to the corner, but his side was to me. You cannot grab enemies from the front, which is so stupid. In The Last of Us Remastered, you could grab enemies from the front when their heads were not even turned in your direction. Like, if their body was facing in your direction, but their head was not facing in your direction, you could grab them, which made so much sense. And there are so many moments on this game where the enemies go into that grace period animation, where they're trying to, like, react to you, and you cannot grab them from the front. And in The Last of Us Part 2, I could have sworn there were certain moments where you could grab enemies from the front. Maybe it was because I was grabbing them from the side, and that was actually a difficulty modifier with grounded difficulty in The Last of Us Part 2, where you could not grab enemies from the front. But there were certain moments where I believe the enemy's body could be facing towards you, but their heads would be facing away, and you'd be able to grab them. But you can't do that on this game. And there are just so many moments where I'm just straight up, like, walking into a guy while he's in that grace period animation, and he refuses to grab the guy when he was able to do that in The Last of Us Remastered. There was even that dedicated animation for it. And there are just a lot of moments where the enemies flick their heads to the side just a bit during some kind of neutral idle animation, and they just spot you out of the blue. And this whole issue of not being able to grab enemies from the front makes this whole issue with the ambient animations the enemies are capable of doing in some kind of neutral state or during an investigative state even more annoying and more broken. And it's so fucking bullshit a lot of the times. And this part right here is another dumb sequence. So this sequence, you probably don't even remember this sequence from The Last of Us Remastered because it worked as intended. You sprinted at the very beginning, you got into the building, and then you crouched and you moved slowly to avoid the enemies. They didn't even have time to investigate the buildings, and it worked perfectly fine. But here, they decided to turn this into a spectacle section. And when I say a spectacle section, it means that you have to remain with your AI at all times. As soon as they move, that's when you move. But it's not communicated very well. And normally when you have these kind of tutorial sections or these kind of spectacle sections, the developers are very keen on communicating this idea to you that you have to remain with your AI partner at all times. Or if you don't have AI partners, you just simply go through this kind of scripted path, you go through this very rigid section, and you don't think anything of it. Like, it's communicated very well. But here, it's not communicated very well because you're so used to this being a typical stealth sequence where you just run past everyone and then you crouch at the right moment and you just move. But you have to go with the flow of this section, but it just doesn't communicate it very well. Like, as soon as this guy moves to the right, that's when the AI moves. But you don't know that they're doing scripted animations. You don't know that they're going on very specific walk cycles. The game doesn't make it clear to you. It doesn't make it clear to you at all. And I spent almost an hour trying to understand what the hell I was supposed to be doing. And I was hearing Tess saying, oh, let's distract them. And I tried to distract them, but certain enemies would not even follow the distraction, and they would see me. And then that guy on the walkway, that guy has the most bullshit peripheral vision I have ever seen. He's able to spot you at a distance that doesn't make any sense. And if you don't move exactly between the buildings when the AI moves, he's going to spot you every single time. And there's also something I've noticed with this game. I think the direction of your camera plays a role in the enemy's ability to spot you. because I think if you were to turn your camera to the left to face him and you were going into the next building by just walking sideways, he would spot you. Yet, if you were to move at the exact same moment, like what I did just then, when I was moving with the AI, because my camera wasn't on him, he wasn't able to recognize me. I think the direction of your camera somehow shifts your hitbox forward. I could be wrong though, but it really feels like it. But it's more noticeable at a longer distance, because that's when you really notice this kind of weird behavior on the enemies in relation to the camera. And this is something you gotta bear in mind when you're doing these sequences and you have enemies at a greater range. If your camera is not on the enemies, then most likely they will not spot you at a long range. And moving on, we have this part right here. So they haven't changed this. You're still going to take mandatory damage in this part, which isn't that big of a deal, but it can lead to a lot of confusion, because there are so many opportunities for the enemies to take advantage of the holes present with the mechanics in order to damage you. And this is where I need to talk about the melee, because the melee on this game is shit. This is the worst melee system in all of the Last of Us series. Like, at least in The Last of Us Part 2, even though the melee didn't actually make the enemies flinch, you at least had the ability to go prone and force the enemies into a slow animation, then allowing you to melee them. And also, you could dodge. You could dodge to bypass this issue with enemies hyper-armoring through your attacks. But there's no dodge system on this game, and Naughty Dog said that they wanted to actually not include the dodge. Like, not including the dodge was an intended design choice for some reason. I can't remember the reasoning that guy gave, but I think he said it was because they designed the enemies a particular way and they wanted to preserve that, just like with the original, but it doesn't work very well with certain parts. And the melee on this game suffers because of this. Because what they've done is they've kind of designed the foundation of the melee around The Last of Us Part 2. But they've given the flinch animations that the enemies can go into based on The Last of Us Remastered. Yet, these are Last of Us Part 2 enemies. These enemies are literally designed with the same kind of mentalities as The Last of Us Part 2 enemies. So they have very similar capabilities of like being able to glide towards you to damage you, or you get moments where they do these very fast animations that you wouldn't be able to avoid without the dodge system. And what they've done to make these issues even more of a problem is they've made Joel's melee so slow. Like, you know those moments where you do a 3-hit combo and on the third hit, Joel just knocks the enemy away? Well, in The Last of Us Remastered, you didn't sit through some kind of lengthy recovery period. You were immediately able to attack the enemy when Joel pushed them back. But here, you have to wait until the recovery animation is finished, where Joel's in the recovery frames of doing that big punch at the end of his 3-hit combo. And the enemies, because they're able to cancel their animation so fast, and because they're afforded very fast animations, there are moments where, before you even have a chance to continue your combo after the third hit, they can damage you. And it's one of the most bullshit designs that I've ever seen with the Last of Us series by far. I don't ever remember these kind of problems in the other games. And what's also problematic is the fact that Joel sometimes chooses not to melee. I've had moments where Joel has actually like stepped forward towards an enemy to try to punch him, but he doesn't punch. Or I get moments where he has a two-handed weapon out, and he tries to melee, but his punch doesn't come out. And even when you do have a one-handed melee weapon out, or some kind of, like, gun in hand, he doesn't melee sometimes. It's so fucking bullshit. So you have to approach this game with an extra bit of caution, because the melee on this game is buggy. It's finicky, it's clunky, and I don't understand how that's possible. And did you see that just then? That was me throwing the bottle. Well, there are times on this game where I try to throw a bottle, and Joel doesn't throw the bottle. His animation gets canceled out for no reason at all. And, you know, there are times where he goes into the animation of throwing it, but the bottle doesn't come out of his hand. Or I had moments during the recording of this walkthrough where I picked up a bottle off the ground, and I waited a bit for an enemy to get close to me, and then Joel, for some unknown reason, chose to put the bottle or brick away when he should have been holding it in his hand because I equipped it. And he goes into the animation of putting it away, and I'm mashing R2 to try to throw the brick or bottle, and he doesn't throw it. And I've included it in the blooper section of this video, and it's so stupid. And this right here was unfortunate. But I had to restart the encounter because I got screwed by the same issue that is apparent in The Last of Us Part 2. So clickers on this game are equally as broken as in The Last of Us Part 2, where when they go into the echolocation animation, where they actually shriek towards the direction that they're facing, like this animation right here. When they go into this animation has a huge lingering hitbox on it. So even after they finish the animation, there are times where they will still spot you because the hitbox on that move is still active, and it occurred in this walkthrough, and I've included it in the blooper section. So it's clear that even though they remade this game from the ground up, what they've done is they've taken a lot of the assets from The Last of Us Part 2 and integrated it into this game, but they haven't fixed the issues present with The Last of Us Part 2, and it's just so tragic and so badly designed. And also, clickers on this game, you cannot melee clickers unless you have a brick or some kind of melee weapon. And speaking of the melee weapons, there's a huge problem with the melee weapons. If your melee weapon happens to break, there's this really stupid animation that Joel goes into where he has to inspect the weapon and then he throws it away. This is the same kind of bullshit like in Resident Evil 2 Remake, where when you broke your knife in that game, the character was inspecting your knife, but you couldn't move and you couldn't sprint. And why the fuck would any individual in a realistic scenario spend more time looking at their knife being broken when there's an enemy right in front of them and they risk getting hit? Who the fuck does that? And there is a similar kind of issue in this game when your melee weapon breaks in the middle of a combo. And it mainly happens when it breaks on the third hit of your melee combo. And I've included this in the questionable designs of The Last of Us Remake Part 1 video. But to talk more about clickers, clickers on this game are just as rigidly designed as in The Last of Us Part 2. The developers expect you to handle the clickers in a certain way. And in The Last of Us Remastered, there are so many different ways of dealing with clickers and still being able to save up on your ammunition. Like, if clickers grabbed your AI partners, you could punch them and initiate a combo. Or when an AI partner damages the clicker gets put into a flinch animation, and you can punch the clicker during that animation. I mean, it wasn't recommended, it was better to do like a running attack on them, but you could deal damage. Like, it was so interesting finding all these different ways of dealing with clickers, but your options for dealing with clickers in the middle of open combat are so limited. And there are times where, for instance, in the school sequence, where I'm dealing with a clicker while there are runners around, I get rid of the runners, and I'm just waiting for the clickers to attack one of my AI partners, but they're just not going for them because clickers on this game have a fixation on you. They will ignore your AI partner just to prioritize you, and your AI partners do absolutely nothing to help. And there are just so many moments where I'm just playing Ring Around the Rosie with these clickers, trying to save up on my ammunition. The clickers just track you down so much. Your AI partners do absolutely nothing to help you. And it's just, the game doesn't allow flexibility with dealing with clickers. The only possible way you're going to be dealing with clickers is with your guns, with bricks, and your melee weapons, and that's it. But good luck relying on those in the encounter select, because the encounter select on this game is equally as bad as the encounter select in The Last of Us Part 2, because when you start encounters in the encounter select, for whatever reason, the game spawns you in with almost no ammunition for your weapons 99% of the time, and very rarely will you ever get an encounter where you actually spawn in with good amounts of loot. And I don't know who designed the encounter select for The Last of Us Part 2 and The Last of Us Remake, but they must have been the same person. And again, they should be fired because the encounter select isn't reflective of a normal individual's playstyle. What individual is going to go into a Pittsburgh section with no ammunition for any of their weapons, or no bricks or bottles, and you're only left with like a Molotov and a nail bomb? It's almost like the encounter select is built for the 0.001% of individuals who can play a game like a normal human being and they suck at life. Is that really the kind of audience you want to target with an encounter select? Is that really something that is appealing to a larger audience? Like, the only time the encounter select ever really seems serviceable is when you're doing stealth encounters that don't require any ammunition whatsoever. When it comes to combat encounters, the encounter select can suck balls. It's absolutely atrocious. And I don't understand that, because Uncharted 4 had a better encounter select system. Of course, then again, Uncharted 4 is a different kind of genre entirely. It's action-adventure, and its inventory system isn't quite the survival horror inventory system. You're not carrying previous loot into future encounters like you are in this game. Like, maybe that's just a consequence of the kind of genre you're trying to base your encounter select in, but there are many other ways you could be doing this. I mean, just have it where the encounter select uses the loot from your chapter save. It's that simple. That way it's a little bit more reflective of your playstyle. And there may be some limited capabilities to this methodology, but that's kind of your fault for playing the game like shit when you should have been learning the game properly. I don't get it at all. But we've just done some of the combat encounters. We just did that museum encounter. The game gives plenty of bottles and bricks to deal with the enemies that rush you, but feel free to use some revolver ammo for that sequence, and that way you can make the sequence less awkward, and you can also take advantage of the bricks and bottles more effectively. One thing that I really like about this game compared to The Last of Us Remastered is the fact that whenever Joel stuns an enemy with a brick or a bottle and you press square on them, he does that very fast kick animation. And when he does the kick animation, there's some Last of Us Part 2 tech where when you go into a strike attack animation, the surrounding enemies are flinched. So it gives you time to get away. And that's one of the better design choices that this game embraces. That being said, this game once again shoots itself in the foot with the way it's implemented the mechanic. So when you throw a bottle or a brick at an enemy and you stun them, you have to press square twice, but you have to not be sprinting. Because what happens is, when you press square on a stunned enemy, Joel will knock them to the ground with a punch, and then you have to press square again to kill them with a kick. And if you're sprinting, or sometimes when you do it at range, Joel doesn't do the animation where he knocks him to the ground. He'll sometimes just start the normal combo, and that can be problematic if there are enemies surrounding you, because it's impossible to really get out of the melee unscathed if there are surrounding enemies nearby, because Joel kind of stays within the animation, because he's kind of stuck to it. It's almost like in Uncharted 2, where when you start melee with an enemy, you're kind of pulled into the animation, and you can't leave melee until you kill the enemy. But at least this game doesn't have anything as egregiously sticky as how it is in Uncharted 2. But back to what I was saying, I don't know why they don't give Joel a dedicated strike attack animation. I mean, it works exactly the same way as The Last of Us Remastered, which it shouldn't, though. Like, in The Last of Us Part 2, whenever you press square on a stunned enemy, Ellie or Abby would do a designated strike attack animation where they would do a very cinematic strike attack animation. It was a cammed animation, and it would instantly kill the enemy. But here, you have to hope that the game gives you good detection on the knockdown attack that Joel does before it allows you to press square again to do the kick attack. And you have to not be sprinting, and you have to be pretty close to the enemy for it to work. And it really makes no sense how they could still adhere to this outdated model from The Last of Us Remastered. It's really confusing. Though I do like the speed of Joel's kick when he actually kills a stunned enemy. One of my main problems with the strike attack animations in The Last of Us Part 2 is their length. They lasted a little too long, and it didn't help that in the recovery frames of the strike attack animations in The Last of Us Part 2, you couldn't dodge for a bit. For some reason, the strike attacks in The Last of Us Part 2 put a massive delay on your dodge. So you had to wait a couple of seconds for the dodge to actually be registered, and it was just one of the most clunky designs ever in The Last of Us Part 2, and the only possible way to bypass this is to press square to initiate a melee attack, and then press L1 before your character connects with the enemy. Like, you shouldn't have to do that. It should have been a lot more responsive, and I noticed this several times in the demos that they released for The Last of Us Part 2 before the game actually released. So the fact that I'm at least able to get a very fast strike attack animation with Joel and actually take advantage of the flinch animations generated by my strike attack, which actually stuns the surrounding enemies, that right there is pretty cool. And it's something that can be very helpful for the museum encounter. So just use your bricks and bottles for the museum encounter. Try to get rid of some of the enemies using the revolver, and you'll be fine. But I've just done that stealth sequence in the Capitol building. That sequence is really well designed. The first encounter works really well. The second encounter works really well too. I think it's definitely an improvement over the way the stealth worked in The Last of Us Remastered for the Capitol building, because at least these enemies have designated paths. In The Last of Us Remastered, for certain stealth sequences, for some reason the enemies would go off on random paths when they were supposed to be going on scripted paths. So it looks like they fixed those issues with some of them, but that still doesn't change the fact that this game is weak in comparison to those games. But here are some bloopers. So this right here, I grab the bottle and I'm about to throw it, but for some reason, Joel decides to put it away. I'm mashing R2, nothing is happening. That is a really stupid problem. And here, it happens again, but I was at least able to get it out this time before that guy hit me. But I ended up getting hit right here. And here's the lingering hitbox on this bullshit attack. So watch. Watch this. Look, the clicker finished the animation, but it somehow still spotted me after the animation was done. And that right there, I don't know if that was damage or not, but I think what happened was I threw my bottle, it stunned the guy, but at the same time, he was doing the animation where he pins you against the wall, which is one of the most egregious design choices ever that they inherited from The Last of Us Remastered, and it's a poor design because the infected, whenever you are near a wall and the infected are closing in on you, they have this ability to cancel whatever you're doing and just pin you against the wall. And they can even do it in the middle of combos. This happens so much in The Last of Us Remake. So you have to be very careful when standing near walls that the enemies can pin you against, because they will cancel whatever you're doing and get full priority on that animation. It is so unfair. But welcome to the beginning of this walkthrough. Stay tuned for the future parts. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.